Okay, there we go.
Thanks. So, good evening and welcome everyone to another Socialist Action Theory Thursday, our monthly nerd out events where we come together to analyze a piece of text written by historic Marxist revolutionaries. We learn a lot by delving straight into the source material to discuss how those lessons can be applied today. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Toronto based comrade Corey David on the Teamster Rebellion, written in 1972 by revolutionary labor leader and Minneapolis Trotskyist Farrell Dobbs. It recounts the momentous Teamster strike of 1934 and his role in leading it. Before getting into it, I wanted to mention that if you're watching this on YouTube and would like to be a part of future discussions, please contact Socialist Action Canada at the information below the video. Visit our website, www.socialistaction.ca, to find out more about our initiatives, events, and projects that span coast to coast throughout the Canadian state. On that note, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Tsimshian people in a place called Terrace, BC, and that our comrades and friends are joining us from stolen, unceded lands of Indigenous people across Turtle Island. So without further ado, let's hear from our facilitator tonight. Corey David is a transit operator and member of Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 113 in Toronto. He's a leading member of Socialist Action and has been involved in Indigenous land back, international solidarity, encampment support, May Day actions, and campaigns as a candidate of the Municipal Socialist Alliance. He has faced police violence and the misery that living on the margins brings when laboring as a frontline health service provider. Take it away, Corey.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me host this talk. The Teamster Rebellion is a serious piece of material that revolutionaries should take a look at. As Farrell Dobbs said, it's not instructions or a strategy on how to make a strike or win a strike, but it's a historical record of the conditions, the events, and the strategies and work that went into the Teamsters Rebellion, the 1933 and 1934 strikes of the Teamsters Rebellion. So Farrell Dobbs was a worker in the coal yards of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I think he was about 22 years old when he met Dune, who was a member of the Communist League. Dune came in for a regular load and started talking to Farrell about the work, and sort of inspired him, I guess, to get involved. So most of the workers in Minneapolis or across the states or in the world at this point in time were not organized, or if they were organized, most of them were organized into small craft unions based on their trade. Farrell Dobbs had no such position, but he was. As he worked and saw what was going on around him, saw the way that the bosses and management treated employees, see the way that they left them living on the margins, while they were working 48-hour weeks. And still they were not able to get by. Farrell Dobbs himself had to move in with his parents for a time. Him and his wife had to live with their parents just to make ends meet. So this was pretty regular for the people. I mean, this is the 30s. It's it is the Depression, and there's a lot of unemployment and there's a lot of low wage labor. So Farrell got involved here. Farrell heard what Dune had to say, and he went to a meeting of the Communist League, which was a Trotsky organization, which split off from the Communist Party, which had become Stalinist. So in these early meetings, the Communist League in Minneapolis was pretty small, and a lot of these meetings would just take place at people's homes, and they would talk about sort of the situations and about what was going on around the world. Farrell was intrigued by international politics as well. He was very affected by the Japanese invasion of China, He noted particularly how the international capitalist class in Shanghai enjoyed a protected area, like fenced in and guarded and everything, while the Japanese soldiers just ran wild through the rest of Shanghai, abusing and suppressing the local population. Um, so he could recognize right away the injustice that was there. That's not to say that Farrell Dobbs was some kind of born radical. No one is. He acknowledged himself that um, prior to meeting the Communist League, that he had voted for the Republican Party in the previous federal election, um, the previous year or 2 years prior. So just 2 years from then, he was becoming a revolutionary under the tutelage of the Communist League. So they decided that they wanted to try and organize the drivers into an industrial union to try and strengthen the working class in Minneapolis. Um, they were very disciplined and cautious about the way they went about this work. They didn't just go in and try to explain that they had the right ideas and that they were going to do everything. I mean, it was a hell of a lot of work. There was no union to begin with, so they had to go and talk to each individual truck driver in some cases, or go to the different yards where coal was distributed. I think in this particular time, they were trying to get the truck drivers in the coal yards and the gas yards unionized, or into a union. So they would go being in the trucking business, it was kind of fortuitous that they would be able to meet and greet different people all around, but they had to go and try and find drivers from each different small little company, and encourage them to to join the union fight. So and it was good in that way too, that they could do it away from management and bosses, and away from so that people wouldn't be aware of what was going on exactly. There are other considerations too at this time. The international union, the AFL, American Federation of Labor, was run by a man named Mr. Tobin, and they were very restrictive. Um, they put a lot of restrictions on local unions and on how they operated. Everything had to, if they were going to have any kind of job action or membership drive, or any kind of any business at all, they had to go through the AFL for permission. There were restrictions on that, so they had to try and negotiate with management, no matter what. Only if management would not give any concession could they then again ask the AFL for permission to go on a strike. And the AFL would then direct them to mediation, and then if the mediation didn't work, then the AFL would approve the strike and then support it materially, right? And that was the big thing. So what Farrell Dobbs and the rest of the leadership, well, the would-be leadership, I guess, wanted to do was move past the AFL, but they had to be careful as to not to give away what they were doing, and not to antagonize the international leadership, because they wanted to have support. They didn't want to shoot themselves in the foot before anything even happened. So that's what they did. There was the local 574 Teamsters. That's the union. There was already a trucking union, but it was quite small, and it didn't represent any of the big warehouses or big trucking franchises in Minneapolis. So they worked with someone on the executive board who was somewhat sympathetic to the workers' struggle, and they got him to push the stuff to the AFL, wording it in such a way that it wasn't plain that they were working towards building a strike, which was their goal. They had a lot of strategy that went involved into the first strike. They they got as many people as they could, and they also planned the strike to take place just at the start of winter when it would be cold and when people would need coal the most. Which is a great example of how when they say that like workers shouldn't go on strike because they, we're needed and we're going to hurt society by going on strike. It worked very much in their favor to go on strike just as the cold was really gripping, and to shut down those coal yards and to force the employers to negotiate a fair deal. So this strike, the first strike, shut down the coal yards. They tried to shut down any trucking in the city. Sorry, before I get to that, I should say they did a lot of organizational work before the strike even happened. In terms of they rented out a garage, they put in a commissary there for food supplies. They set up an auxiliary of women to support the strike that was headed up by Farrell Dobbs' wife. They they consulted with other organizations around town. Like there's a lot of farming that takes place around Minneapolis. Minneapolis is essentially it used to be a lot of forest, but it essentially became a big agricultural area after once it was developed in the 1900s or late 1800s. So the farmers were very key to industry. It was the industry in Minneapolis, and so they made overturns towards this organization called the Farmers Holiday Association, and they were sympathetic to the workers' issues, as they themselves, as small farmers, were also facing a lot of issues. They had previously organized themselves against lot sales, where farmers who were in debt or otherwise unable to cover the cost of their plot were protected by the other farmers for having their land sold off. So anyway, so they were sympathetic towards the union as well, and they agreed to the union. The union worked out terms with the farmers so that they could have an agreeable relationship where the farmers could still, I guess, get their deliveries in some sense, as long as it met the union's conditions for operation. So once all this stuff got organized, then the strike went into action. They brought their terms to the boss and said, this is what we need, and we want to be recognized as a union covering all these workers. Because before this, each individual worker, as in most unorganized workplaces, were under individual contract with management. So they said, we want to represent everybody. One of their biggest opponents during this whole period is the Citizens Alliance in Minneapolis, which is essentially a capitalist organization that functioned somewhat like a work program. They would find people could come to their office and they would find people work that, this was a good guy or good boy who will follow the rules, and do what you say no matter what you do. So they would function kind of as a work program, but they were also a propaganda piece and an organizational tool for the capitalists against workers in Minneapolis. Minneapolis. I'm not saying that properly. Anyway, so as once this got set up, they brought these demands to the bosses. The bosses flatly refused them. They said they would not deal with any organized labor at all. These are, from what I understand about reading later in the book, the main employer the main employers who 574 was organizing against were about 66 firms, large trucking and grocery and I guess other goods firms that were set up in Minneapolis. So them together, I guess, within having the Citizens Alliance as their representative or as their sort of organizing body, I guess, told them that they would not deal with the union 574, and they would continue to do so. So going back to what I was saying about the once the coal strike got started in the dead of winter, it didn't take them long to come around to the table. There were other forces at play. There was in power in the governor's seat of Minneapolis was the Farmer Cooperative Party's member, and so he rose to that position on the backs of workers and farmers, being their guy, being someone who would be sympathetic towards their needs and their struggle. So he was put in a position, and this was sort of tactically done as well by the leadership of the union, where he couldn't go against the workers so much because that was his base. But he at the same time, it was understood, and he demonstrated that he was very much so an agent of the government, and was at the utmost ready to service the government as was needed, as his position demanded within the capitalist system, right? So, but being put in this position, he wouldn't just nakedly attack the organizing efforts of the union. So he put pressure on the capitalists as well to come to the table. I mean, not much, not compared to what he would do later to the workers, but he did play some kind of I wouldn't say neutral, but some kind of middle position between the workers and the quite conservative capitalists that were running the city. So the strike was won. An agreement was signed with a certain wage scale between the bosses and local 574. But months after, it was not being respected, and the management was still refusing to recognize that the union represented all the workers in these yards. So they began to organize again, and began to try and fix the situation. There were mistakes that were made in the first organizing drive. I mean, it was quite quite disciplined and quite well run in terms of supports and whatever. But having reached out to the farmers holiday association, they had actually they missed the opportunity to talk to two other farmers associations, and so that sort of burned those associations once the strike got underway, because they were not able to operate in the same fashion. So this time around, they talked to those groups and got them more or less on board. So to sidestep Tobin, the Teamsters and all his restriction policies, the AFL's restrictive policies on organizing, Teamsters 574. Also, I should mention the leaders of the 574, like Dune and sorry, I have the list here. Like Dune and Skoglund, they didn't just go for the union leadership right away. They worked with the in the strike. They worked and they talked to people, and they demonstrated that they were reliable comrades. They weren't comrades at the time, I guess, to the other workers, but they could be trusted, and they were reliable, and they would say what they mean, and they demonstrated that they had the workers' best interests at heart. And then they were able to gain popularity within the union because they demonstrated that they were willing to fight, and that they had good ideas that could actually be put into practice. And once they were tested, they were demonstrated to be good investments. So the workers of the local 574, or I mean, uh, 574 had grown from a couple hundred members into an organization of 3,000 by May 1933. Um, and so the workers elected elected those comrades, among other comrades, to lead the union. But they so what they did was they formed a 100-member strike committee, um, that would be responsible in the motion passed within Local 574, that would be responsible for all decisions made for the strike. That would be responsible for negotiations. It would be responsible for any terms that would be accepted or false. They would, so they in this sense they stopped the AFL from being able to come in and dictate what the strike could do or couldn't do, or what the union had to accept or not accept. Because there's a quote by I think it's by Dobbs, where he says, victories won on the picket line can be lost in negotiations, which is often what happened. A hard fought strike, um, which then got terms met by the employer, to end the strike or whatever, would then go to negotiation, and then the negotiators would end up giving up more, even more than the minimum that the union had won in the strike. So in this way, they didn't want any outside bureaucratic interference from the AFL, or from I think it's the local union. I think it's like their local Minneapolis sort of like Federation of Labor, Federation of Labor. I can't remember what it's called. The CLU, I think it's called. Anyways, so in setting up this next May strike with their 3,000 members, another group they appealed to was the unemployed. Like I mentioned, during the Depression, there was huge amounts of unemployment, and at this time, FDR, Roosevelt, was in power and was president of the United States, and he set up an industrial relief program, mostly to save capital, but it also gave some minimal benefits to workers. It set up work programs, and I guess it increased the social benefits. They were still quite meager, as was attested to, that many people still you basically had to get rid of all your appliances in your house, get rid of any luxury that you ever had. You had to have absolutely nothing, and then you could go on social assistance. And if you got any money from anywhere, your amount would be reduced, similar to today. Anyway, so there was an organization, though, I believe it's called the MCC. I can't remember what that stands for, but it was actually an organization of unemployed workers. I mean, some of these workers were, I guess, veterans. I remember it's from other history that I've learned, veterans from the First World War. There was a lot of unemployment among them, and so despite being unemployed and destitute, there was a lot of organizational structure. Well, for some of them, anyways. But the leaders, especially of that organization, were very organized, and they worked with Teamsters, because there was a constant threat of scabbing, and of course there was obviously because of how desperate people they were desperate. So once the strike got underway, the second strike in May 1933, after the first agreements weren't being met by the employer, and they refused to recognize 574 as the union representing these workers, and they refused to accept the closed shop policy, meaning that workers couldn't just come and go to any union. It would be the 574 would be the union for these workers within this industry. Anyways, they wouldn't accept that. They didn't raise the pay scale as they said they would. And so for all these reasons, the local 574 started making plans to go on strike again. As I mentioned, so in this strike, they basically shut down the whole city. They had flying squads, which they had they had sort of actually had in the earlier strike in the coal yards. They had flying squads of people in their personal cars, or personal cars that were used by the union, going around and stopping trucks. Not just stopping, but performing like intelligence gathering, basically, like uh, finding out what like where these when trucks were coming in, when they were leaving, where they could be blocked, I guess, and continually to harass them through the city. Um, so they made it really hard to be a scab in Minneapolis. I'm sure they got into not. I'm sure that it's documented. They would beat these people up, these scabs. So the police then became more involved with the strike. So there was a they the mayor of the city instructed them to protect and guard the trucks, right? That were coming in. The big area that they were going into was I think it's called Market Square or something like that. But that was where those main employers were set up. And I guess it was a huge district in Minneapolis for the buying and selling and trading of goods. And so uh, the police, I think, at a large strike there, picket there, the police attacked the picketers with clubs and and beat them. I guess in a submission. It was a battle. They call it a running battle, running through the streets. But the police came out in full force, looking to suppress the strike. And so after this event, it gained the strikers a lot of sympathy from other trade unions within the city and other workers across the country. The next day, from what I understand, is that people started bringing in their own clubs. Their woman dropped off the banisters from her railing and from home. Carpenters dropped off pieces of 2x2 that had been cut into a club length, baseball bats. Anyways, the union, the 574, armed themselves with clubs, ready for the next confrontation with police. I should say too, sorry, also at the local 574 Central HQ, they had set up a field hospital as well. And so after this first beating, I think most of the Teamsters were brought back to most of the workers were brought back to the HQ for medical treatment. But the ones that some ended up going to the hospital, and the ones that ended up going to the hospital ended up getting picked up and arrested by police. So then the policy from then on was to bring all workers, unless it was a serious injury that required a hospital, bring them back to HQ. So after that huge fight with police, where the police were beaten by the Teamsters, the police were also using deputies at this time. So they were, through the Citizens Alliance, they were creating deputizing citizens. They said salespeople, people from different walks of life, I guess mostly middle class people, to become deputies. And once this huge fight happened, where a lot of deputies were beaten along with the police, they had a much harder time getting deputies to show up. And so the police were beaten, and they retreated, and it made national news. It inspired workers around the country who were used to seeing the police always on the winning, always giving out the most punishment. But on that day, it was the union that gave the police more punishment than they got, as was said. So it changed it demonstrated that the workers can fight back. They can't fight back as individuals, as extremists, or some kind of adventurist, trying to do something, unthought out and undisciplined. But through a mass movement of workers, thousands of workers fighting together, it is possible to actually have a confrontation with the police. And I mean, there were arrests, but not on a mass scale. It was the police picked on who they could get, I guess, like the people in the hospital. So after that, the strike continued, but more peaceably. They went out without weapons again. They went out unarmed, and they continued to strike. And then I guess all this commotion put a lot of pressure on the governor to try and settle things more so. And I believe he put pressure on. He threatened to mobilize or maybe he did mobilize the National Guard, but the union called him out on it, and they were never mobilized into the city at this point in time. They were put on, I guess, put on alert. But through this pressure, an agreement was eventually reached with the bosses and with management to end the strike. They agreed to the pay scale, and they were ambivalent about the recognition of Local 574. I can't remember if they agreed to it and then later reneged on it. It seems like that's what might have happened. Sorry. So then, by July, again, the management bosses were not paying the scale. They were not recognizing the Local 574. They were firing I guess what they would call agitators or radicals or whatever, and they were hiring their own people, ignoring the seniority list and whatever. So once again, the 574 got ready for a strike. This time they had, I believe, about 6,000 members who had signed up. They asked the AFL again for support in this, and Tobin replied that actually it wasn't Tobin, I believe it was one of his lieutenants or secretaries or something. They had also asked for the $1 fee per new member to be waived in light of how in the first strike they received no support from the AFL. So they asked for it to be waived. The letter sent back from the AFL said that the rules were plain, that it was $1 per person, and did not mention the impending strike at all. So it's quite clear that the AFL was not going to support the strike. So in July, again they walked out in late July, and they started shutting down the city again, with the flying squads picketing, especially the Market Square. So what's interesting about there's lots of interesting. It's an amazing book, but is that as the workers learn, the workers learn as they go through these processes on what to do, right? What will happen to them, what strategies and tactics they should use, and how they should organize themselves, and when they should react and when they should not react, and what that means. And like I said, they've throughout the entire process, these multiple strikes and these organizing drives, they continued to build support. The union continued to build support amongst the city, amongst not just workers, although, like I said, they had massive support amongst the workers. Different workplaces were coming in to try and join 574. They liquefied a taxi union and the rest of the unorganized taxis into 574. But when the third strike came, so they had tremendous support. They had grown tremendous support throughout the city, and yeah. So when this third strike came around, some smaller companies were agreeing to the 574's terms, right? So they would give them permits to operate if they were negotiating in good faith with 574, as well as the taxis union. They had they had formed, I don't know, I think they were in Local 574, but they were continuing to work because they had agreements with, I guess, their bosses or whatever. Um, there was a lot of sympathy from small business owners, um, to keep this strike going. Nurses and doctors also assisted at the headquarters. Anyway, so as they went on the strike in late July, the last week in July is when the strike started, I believe. Some workers wanted to go back out with clubs, but the union they discussed it, and that was a big thing. They discussed everything. That the 100-member strike committee, they would go over what was the ongoings and discuss and analyze, and then they would strategize themselves, but they would always bring back with everything to the membership for discussion and for vote. So they continued to do this, and this was so important in educating people, because along with all the regular capitalist propaganda, there was a lot of red scaring going on. In the newspaper, they were claiming that the leaders of 574 were communists, which they were, some of them. But there's a lot of red baiting going on, saying that the press was claiming that these were insurrectionists, that they were traitors to the workers, that they were going to lead them into disaster, that they were had no care for them at all. And it's funny, even during the second strike, Tobin wrote an editorial calling them monsters. It was quite strange, the wording that he used, but he really demonized the leadership of the union in his attack article. So but all these taught the workers lessons about the nature of society, about the nature, not of the capitalist society, about the nature of the relationship between workers and capitalists, and the nature of the police, the nature of the government, the nature of bourgeois parties. This whole experience was very educational, because it destroyed the illusions that are all around us, that are still around us, but it destroyed the illusions that they had at the time of what the world was. Yeah, and so they walked out the last week in July, and they started with no clubs or whatever. They went out. Well, they didn't bring back clubs at all, but they started peacefully again, and the police were issued. The police. What I was going to say is the police also learned, or the more so I should say, the bosses and the capitalists also learned what was going on. They learned that they couldn't rely on deputies to administer state violence, and they hired more police. They increased the police budget, the city, and they started arming them with I don't know if they're called riot shotguns or riot guns. They're essentially shotguns, but they use large shot, instead of like bird shot. It's I guess larger balls, I guess, in each shell. Anyways, I guess they're designed to control riots. Maybe they're not exactly lethal. Well, they can be lethal, but they're not exactly like a rifle or something, I guess. So they equipped the entire police force with riot shotguns. Some police, I guess maybe who had a conscience or were turned off from the previous violence, flat out refused to take their shotgun, and they were immediately suspended from service. And Farrell Dobbs was on a bit to talk about how, like, this has, along with what I was saying about the naked nature of police and society to uphold capital and uphold the protection of property, and serve, the lords above all else. Dobbs goes on to talk about how that is the nature of the police as an institution. But they also and it can change, the entire makeup, like anything, like an organization like Socialist Action, like anything, can change from day to day as new members and move in or move out or whatever, and their consciousness or their contribution is either put in or taken out. But because of the way the police operate, where they don't want anyone to, they want you to use brute force at a moment's notice, no matter what the circumstances. The people who have consciousness are weaned out of the organization, or they're never promoted, so that only the most violent reactionary parts of that organization will rise to the top and will flourish. It's anyways, just a side note that Farrell Dobbs talked about, which is very important. So they issued these shotguns to the police, and they set a trap. So the first day, I guess, the strike went on. The second day, the police set a trap. They had a truck go into Market Square, heavily guarded by I don't know if it was 50 or 100 police. And on the truck it said hospital goods or something like that. They made it very clear that it was a hospital truck. They loaded the truck, they delivered it. The union intelligently did not bite on this trap. I mean, especially with 100 cops all brandishing shotguns. They had no interest in getting involved in that. I shouldn't say no interest, but they were smart enough and disciplined enough in their policy and in their instruction that they didn't touch the truck and they left it alone. The capitalist press went into a blitz saying, "Oh, like the strike is broken. We delivered a truck," right? Anyway, so the next day they tried it again, but this time they tore off the hospital signs. Or they probably used a different truck. Anyways, but they used a regular truck, and they loaded one box onto it, or 150 pounds, whatever the weighing was, about 150 pounds, I believe, of whatever the product was. And again, they had an armed guard of about 100 police officers escort the truck. They loaded the truck. They pulled the truck away. And as the truck pulled away, Teamsters got in their own vehicles. I believe it was also some kind of, I don't know, it's some kind of pickup. Anyways, they said they had about 10 Teamsters standing in the back of it, and they followed the truck and the police as it left the market section of the city. And as they followed it, at one point the police just opened fired on the strikers in the vehicle. Immediately people were knocked to the ground, wounded, and yeah, all hell broke loose. It was such a frenzy, it's reported, that the police, when they started shooting, that they shot one of their own sergeants in the craziness of it all. I think about 67 people were wounded. About 50 of those were picketers. The remaining 12 or so were I think most of them were from the unemployed section that was in support of the Teamsters. 67 people wounded. Their comrades, their fellow workers, ran through through storms of bullets, or whatever they were, stoles of buckshot, to rescue their comrades from trying to drag themselves to safety on the ground or whatever. And some of them were wounded in the process as well. Yeah, so they were able to get most of these people back to the headquarters, the garage, and once they were there, they were treated as best they could by the volunteer nurses and the women's auxiliary. I think Farrell Dobbs' wife remembers giving like a young man a cigarette, and he said thanks before he passed out. Anyway, so they were able to get most of the workers back there, and then after about an hour, the ambulances started pulling in to take people to the hospital, because obviously a lot of the injuries were more severe than what the headquarters could handle with their makeshift field hospital. They were called that people had blue welts, I guess, from the buckshot all over them, oozing blood, and yeah, so it's pretty brutal. I'll just say now that there was an inquisition or an investigation into what happened, and it acknowledged that the police were at no time under any threat, that they they acted aggressive on their own accord, with no rationale or reason to do so. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think anything came of that in terms of justice against the police. In fact, when I was in Minneapolis years ago, Socialist Action visiting Socialist Action SA for their convention, we went. They had just gotten our comrade. I can't remember his name, Dave Smith. They had just gotten a plaque put up to commemorate the tragedy that happened there in Market Square. But for what is almost, I guess, 100 years or nearly 100 years, the police blocked the recognition of this event.
The comrade was Dave Reilly.
Dave Reilly, yes, thank you. He wrote the short piece also that is referenced in tonight's talk on the summary of the Teamsters Rebellion. Anyways, getting back to what happened. So these people were taken to hospital. I think there were 8 nurses that volunteered to be on call 24/7, unpaid. 3 doctors helped in the surgery as well. Yeah, so it was a pretty brutal defeat for the workers there. Obviously, naked state violence on full display. But they didn't. What's amazing about all this stuff is, like, I'm sure they had times when they were down and felt not hopeful about what the situation was going to be, but they never gave up. The leaders of the organization, they never lamented. They always just thought about, okay, what, the way it seems it's written anyways, is what do we do next? What is our next move? What should we have to do after analyzing and trying to understand the situation as best they could? How best can they use the resources and the forces they have to turn it around or to better their situation, right? Anyway, so as this was a massive defeat for the Teamsters in terms of just they were brutally suppressed and obviously I don't know, and not great. But the reports of this came out in the city and came out across the country, and they received all kinds of support and sympathy, because obviously a lot of union members were wounded or were injured. They were not able to properly guard their headquarters, so other trade unionists came out in support of them. I believe it was said the electrical workers came out holding steel bars in front of the union HQ, or the strike HQ, I should say. Yeah, 47 men were wounded. I think they pulled out something like 167 shots from their bodies. 3 men were seriously injured, and 2 of them died. Henry Ness and John Baylor were the 2 that died, succumbing to their wounds. They held a small family ceremony for Ness, and then they also held a march, a funeral procession for him, where 20,000 people marched, whether they be the Teamsters themselves or supporters. And about 20,000 people stood on the sidewalk, I guess, as the procession proceeded. Yeah, after this event, the police were essentially demonized by they weren't demonized, they demonized themselves by what they did. An article, there was still, the capitalist press still lauded the bravery of the police force in this action, and they said they were spreading fear of the union being insurrectionists, and the union wrote in there what I should have said. They started a union newspaper, The Organizer, and when the strike got into swing, they started making it a daily publication so that they could be right up to date with everything that was happening and inform their members and the public of what was going on from their perspective. So an article came out from the capitalist press saying, do you want the communists running the streets or something like that? And the Organizer came out, do you want murderers running the streets of Minneapolis, referring to the police, of course. So the police were, there are people that called for the resignation of the police chief, as well as the resignation of the mayor, and the governor. I also had a lot of letters to the governor. People who thought that he'd be more supportive were angry at him. Anyways, so this event, even though it was a catastrophe, gained the union even more support, and again illustrated the nature of the system. Dobbs said earlier, I believe this was he said that the police were going to use force, and that he wanted them to prove it, to show that that's what's going to happen. This is before the gun battle. This is when the clubbing event happened. But he wanted workers to know what it means, to face off against the bosses and the cops and whatever, and the state, and what they're really about. So, but so the strike continued, and the police continued to guard trucks. They continued to have about 100 police officers per truck. And when it was kind of working, I guess they were making, a few deliveries a day or something. I don't know, but they decided to reduce the amount of police officers, and when they reduced the amount of police officers, the union increased the amount of picketers that would go after them, follow them around, and during this time, if truckers were found, they were harassed and beaten by the union. If scabs were found. So this wasn't really working. The police force, it wasn't efficient, even though they had been able to make a few deliveries. It was in no way what was needed to operate these businesses in a profitable sense. So eventually, the governor calls in the military, the militia, to take over the city, and the militia will issue permits for truckers to operate. Sorry, one second. So there were also two mediators brought in from the federal government to try and work out a deal, I guess, between the difference between the capitalists and the workers. Local 574. So when the governor called in the military, he said that these mediators that are coming up with some kind of agreement between you two, whatever it is, whatever they come up with, I'm going to force it on you both, right? He said he would force both the local 574 and the owners, the employers, to accept the deal. So the mediators did speak to the union, and they came up with a pay scale. They took what the union was asking for. They came up with a pay scale that was a little bit reduced, but they kept that 574 would organize these workers. One point of contention that was big in this fight, along with the recognition of 574, was also organizing people who were connected to the trucking shipping businesses, but not directly involved in the specific labor of trucking. So the bosses did not want any of these people signing union cards or being represented by 574. They said it should be confined to just the people who are involved in driving, in lifting and loading the trucks, unloading and loading the trucks, and I guess people like directly involved in the trade, thus sort of making it again back into a craft union. Well, somewhat. So in this job classification section in the mediators agreement, it's it allowed for those people to gain union ratification in the small shops, I believe, but in the larger shops, it would not allow them to gain to sign a union card, to be part of the union. And anyway, so the union looked at what was offered from the mediators, and they said we're getting all our basic things right. It's recognizing Local 574 as a closed shop. In this, it's recognizing our the workers. There are concessions to do with pay. There are concessions to do with not recognizing the supplementary jobs as union jobs, but they were able to wedge that issue in some sense. And they also analyzed the situation. The the militia had taken over the city, and the threat was to them to that if they didn't accept it, then the military would come in and crush the strike essentially. So they decided to be tactical. They got the deadline at 12 noon. They had a meeting about it the night before, but there were threats. There were rumors that a raid was going to happen on the HQ by police. So they actually dispersed that meeting and rushed back to the headquarters, but it was a false alarm. But these rumors continued to go on. Anyways, in the morning they held another meeting, and after presenting their analysis and their recommendation, it was discussed, and the union endorsed accepting the deal. But they waited until 12 noon, the deadline, because they didn't want to give the capitalists any more information than they needed to. They wanted to try and catch them off guard, not knowing, maybe assuming that they would, not accept the deal or whatever, and not giving them the chance to start publishing, press about either accepting, anyways, about the circumstance. So 12 noon came. The union called the governor. They told him they accepted the deal. And then the bosses said, we accept the deal with reservations. So they did not accept the deal. So the union then wrote, in their paper saying, what would happen if we said that we didn't accept the deal? Because what happened was nothing happened when the company said they didn't accept the deal. Nothing happened. They were once again left in limbo about what to do. So at this point, the military escalated actions. They, I don't know, I don't know why, I guess exactly, but I guess the governor was maybe hoping to create a situation where he could justify, crushing the union, and not totally ruin his image in the eyes of his voters. Anyways, the military raided the headquarters of the strike. They asked who was in charge. What's his name? Grant Dune said that he was. The colonel told him he was under arrest. Then he showed a list of a bunch of other names. People gave a warning to Farrell Dobbs, slyly to get out of there because he was on the list along with other leaders. Skoglund was out of town trying to raise money for the strike, so he was also on the list, but not able to be picked up by the military. Anyway, so they raided the place. They arrested a bunch of leadership. They put them in the stockades that they had made at the fairgrounds where the military was encamped, and they held them there for quite a while. So the union then, under this threat, started operating out of. They decided to decentralize, and they started operating out of smaller command posts around the city, some sympathetic coal yards and whatever. They started operating out of smaller smaller command posts, so they weren't at risk of being raided by the military. And yeah, they continued to try and stop the scabs from operating, but they did. They would. I think they moved on from trying to attack people to just sabotaging vehicles and whatever whenever they could. The military wasn't escorting vehicles around; they were just issuing permits, and I guess in a general occupation of the city. So they were still able to do this. There were about, I think they said on the first day of it, 38 arrests, but they continued to fight. They continued to fight even in the face of the military and police repression and the state. They continued to fight, and eventually word reached them that the AFL was trying to get in touch with them because the governor wanted to talk to them. He had already talked to the members that were in the stockades and the fairgrounds, but they said they wouldn't negotiate from a prison cell. And so Dobbs agreed to meet with the governor. And when he went they were at the AFL headquarters in Minneapolis. And when he went there were a bunch of business agents from the AFL. They were all in a room, or they were all there. And they said that the governor is talking to members of the strike committee. And so he had been talking to some of the most militant members of the strike committee, and they were giving him a hard time about what was going on, obviously. And so Dobbs entered and discussed. He asked them, why he was doing all this, and the governor came with all kinds of excuses, saying that he had heard there were weapons in the headquarters, and then there were some weapons because after the police shooting, some Teamsters started bringing in guns and knives, looking to either protect themselves or retaliate. I don't know. But the union made it a very strict policy of any car going out was to be inspected and any weapons were to be confiscated. And Dobbs said this is the hardest thing he ever had to do, because they were just shot at by the police, and I don't know if the death had happened yet, but obviously he could understand why the workers, why workers wanted to defend themselves and wanted to fight. But looking at the long picture, they had to be more disciplined and more patient about what they were doing. Anyways, so getting back to the meeting with the governor, he asked them to release the people in the stockades to stop issuing military permits and to start letting the union continue the strike peacefully as it was doing, and then they would negotiate from there. To which the governor agreed, I guess, because he did release them, and it went on. Those two mediators that came with the previous deal were recalled. A new mediator was sent to try and negotiate the deal. So this part of the book is called the War of Attrition, and the strike is ongoing, but it's in sort of a limbo area, I guess, because the employers are not coming to the table, and then I think the union is still having to contend with the military. No. Yeah, so the strike continued, and negotiations continued. Yeah, and eventually, and everyone was worn out. The workers were worn out, and by the same degree, the bosses were worn out. The Citizens Alliance had was really struggling. There were certain companies that were looking to break away and accept the deal that was on the table with 574. And eventually that happened. And eventually a deal was meted out, and Local 574 got recognition. Yeah, so that's the general history of it. I'm sorry, it was a bit broken. I'm just didn't put it together in the most concise way. But I really recommend the book. I think it's a great example of a working class struggle. It's a great inspiration of workers, of just people, being in the struggle and being radicalized and trained and learning the correct, not the correct, but learning what it means to be, to fight for your class and to fight for more, and also learning what it takes to win, and that it really is a struggle, and not to have, not to be idealistic in who can do what and what is what, but to take a sober look at the situation and the circumstances and the forces at play, and to have the to be driven and to plan for such a victory, even as the circumstances change and difficulties arise. Anyways, I really recommend the book. The quote at the beginning of it, I'll just say from Dobbs before we get into the discussion, is to the men and women who gave me unshakable confidence in the working class, the rank and file of general drivers, Local 574. I'll leave it at that. Begin the discussion.
Thanks, Corey. That was awesome. I went through the whole book. Thanks for going through that. Yeah, I learned a lot. I want to ask just a couple general questions, and you can throw it out to the rest of the folks here. Yeah, what are your kind of main takeaways from it, like in terms of what we can learn or how we can apply some of that today? And I know at the start you mentioned how Dobbs was analyzing the conditions more than kind of like a how-to manual. So what was your kind of sense of what those conditions were back then that, allowed for that to happen or gave the right opportunity for that to happen? And how can we kind of like keep an eye out for that?
Sure. Do you want me to answer those, or do you want to go into other questions?
Go for it.
Sure. So the main takeaways that we as an organization in Socialist Action, or I guess as individual socialists or revolutionaries looking to change the world, can take away is that nothing is innate. Everything is developed and forged into what it is. And so Farrell Dobbs, like I said, mentioned he voted Republican before he became radicalized. And as I was talking to Barry about it earlier today, there's a bunch of groups and people that fought in this struggle for Local 574 and for themselves, for better conditions, for better life for themselves, because Local 574 did a great job working with the unemployed, and I'll link that to the conditions a bit. Just about the unemployed, a lot of the workers in 574 were truckers. Sometimes are seasonal, depending, especially with farmers in a northern climate. Obviously, it's a lot of seasonal work. And same thing with the coal yards in the winter. It's when they're busy. So a lot of the time, these truckers were also unemployed, and so they could really relate to the situation that the masses of unemployed were in. Yeah. So what other takeaways? The Communist League, which Farrell Dobbs was a part of, which is the organization that entered this union in the idea of turning it into an industrial union and waging this battle. They were Trotskyists, and they were fighting against, at the time, the Stalinists and the Communist Party, which at this time is called the Third Period, I believe. It's sort of an ultra left Stalinist organization going on, and the Stalinists, tried to weasel their way into the union multiple times. They tried to attack the leadership. They would ask for ask to be able to speak, ask to be able to be on the committees and whatever. And then when they were denied because they weren't involved at all, they would then turn to attacking them. So very, very fickle. But I think Dobbs was very, I'm going to say sober again. The Communist League was very sober in its actions and applications to all these things going on. And that was something that I think, we should learn from them and be about. It's not that they were ever soft or weak or whatever. They dealt with all kinds of stuff, but they're very disciplined and patient about it. They believe with working, they didn't want power just for themselves. They weren't trying to get that right away. And even for the betterment of others, they weren't trying to get that away because they knew that they couldn't do it. You can't just go in and demand, the crown. You have to earn it. And especially in the face of working people, you have to earn it. So that's those are some of the takeaways anyways. And the conditions, I'll just say, like I was saying with the underhouse, the conditions were brutal in the 30s, and in Minneapolis, it seems like some barons really ran the city to the point where most working people were living in poverty, even if they are working. Dobbs talks about, like I said, he had to move in with his parents early on in the work there. It's also, the workers saw that if they stood up, if they did anything, they learned over time and they saw over time, but they'd see this on the job as well, that they would be immediately have reprisals against them from the bosses, from management. And so, it's not just the economic conditions, but the conditions of their everyday lives, I guess, that really pushed them to work. It's amazing that they were able to, but I think that, again, that was just, everyone was so it was so ingrained in them what was going on around them that they were able to get so much support. And it wasn't, again, immediate. They had to build it. But the Women's Auxiliary, it was quite large, but I believe it started with 50 members. But just the amount that people were willing to put into it, I think, because they saw an opportunity here for a better life, and they were tired of putting up with the same old shit, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what else about the conditions I could say. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's great. Yeah. Barry, I see your hand.
Yeah, Corey, thank you for a wonderful presentation and exhaustive examination of the conditions in 33 and 34, and a detailed presentation of a book that every socialist should read. I want to identify 6 major lessons for me, and I first read this book shortly after it was published in the 70s. And come back to it again and again because it's so rich. The 6 points are: 1, union democracy; 2, the united front; 3, mass action; 4, defensive demands; 5, the workers' press; and 6, the Revolutionary Party. So let me just take a few seconds on each. Union democracy was crucial to the success in building this local 574 of the Teamsters Union. And they didn't make a move without, exerting themselves with efforts to enlarge the rank and file of the union that they strove to organize on the broader and broader basis possible. And they discussed everything. And Corey made the point that they came back. I mean, they talked about everything in the Committee of 100 and the strike committee. It's a big strike committee. That's like every activist who's willing to pledge their time and in some cases their lives to this effort. They discussed everything in the union as a whole. It was remarkable and a prime example of what we mean by union democracy. Secondly, the United Front. They knew, even though the workers were the majority class, that they needed the farmers, that they needed the unemployed, that they needed women, that they needed all layers of society who are not part and parcel of the boss class to work together and to ensure a wider and wider influence in the broader community. Mass action. Everything they did was geared towards demonstrating broad support for the union and to mobilizing public support. And even at the lowest point, when they were attacked and pulverized by the state, including the militia, they sought to win over public sympathy, and everything that they did was informed by that logic. Fourthly, defensive demands. They, of course, as revolutionaries, they and we today want to overthrow this rotten society, this rule by the tiny minority, the super rich. But they never posed that as a demand. Unlike the anarchists, unlike the Stalinists in the third period, ultra-left period of Stalinism, they didn't say, smash the state, smash capitalism, we're taking over. No, they said, we're here to give people representation in the workplace, and we're here to raise wages, and we're here to make it possible for people to survive this depression. That was the correct approach. It may sound brave to demand the impossible, but you win by demanding the possible and by using democratic methods to do it. Fifthly, the workers' press. The organizer was brilliant. This is how they reached the rest of the population, as well as the rank and file of the union. And it was a model. Any striker who wanted to write for it could. Of course, they had skilled comrades leading it. But it was open. And they sold the paper on the street. But they also, I'm sure they gave away a few thousand copies from time to time. Because the important thing was to raise public awareness and strengthen the confidence of the working class to win. And finally, the Revolutionary Party and how instrumental it is. What is the Revolutionary Party? It's not just a scheme, and it's not just a pyramid. It's the concentrated experience of the working class. Where does this come from? In their day, it came from the Paris Commune of 1871. It came from all of the big battles that took place during and after World War I, including the Russian Revolution. They drew on this, but not everybody is born to do this. This takes an effort. And it requires a structured organization to transmit these lessons. That's where the Revolutionary Party is instrumental, and that's what it takes to win. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry. I see your hand there, Rubina.